When you strip away the sound effects, the dramatic thumbnails, the urgent warnings, and the constant "this is it" tone, what you're really left with is a story. And stories can be powerful. They can inspire, they can warn, they can even educate. But stories become dangerous when they're sold as certainty, especially when the evidence doesn't back them up. That's where we need to slow things down and look carefully at what was said, when it was said, and what actually happened afterward. For a long time, the narrative has been very clear and very confident. Total collapse is imminent. The system is about to fail. The clock is always at 5 seconds to midnight. And if you question that timeline, the response is never, "Let's review the data." Instead, it's, "You just don't get it," or "I was early, not wrong." But here's the issue with that excuse. Being early once or twice is understandable. Being early for years, while constantly resetting the deadline, is something else entirely. Let's talk about predictions, because that's where the cracks start to show. Dates were hinted at, windows were defined, certain events were framed as unavoidable triggers, and yet, time after time, those moments passed. Markets didn't behave the way they were supposed to. Systems bent, adapted, absorbed the shock, and kept moving. Instead of accountability, what followed was revision. The narrative shifted just enough to stay alive, just enough to keep the fear fresh, but never enough to admit that the original premise might be flawed. And that's a pattern worth paying attention to. When a claim is built on solid ground, it can survive scrutiny. When it's not, it needs constant maintenance. It needs new villains, new emergency updates, new reasons why this time is different. The goalposts move not because reality changed overnight, but because the original claim couldn't stand still without collapsing under its own weight. Another red flag is how selective the evidence becomes. One data point that supports the narrative is amplified and repeated endlessly. 10 data points that contradict it are ignored, dismissed, or mocked. Context disappears. Nuance becomes the enemy. Everything has to fit the script, because if the script breaks, the entire persona built around it starts to wobble. This isn't analysis anymore, it's confirmation bias wrapped in confidence. Now let's talk about credibility. Real analysts, the ones who actually respect their audience, do something very uncomfortable when they're wrong. They admit it. They revise their models. They explain what they missed. That process builds trust. But here, accountability is replaced with certainty theater. Confidence is projected so strongly that viewers start mistaking volume for accuracy. And when confidence is monetized, that's when skepticism becomes absolutely necessary. Because let's be honest, fear sells. Fear keeps people watching. Fear keeps people clicking. Fear keeps people buying products, joining communities, and waiting for the next warning. There's a business model here, and it depends on the crisis never quite arriving, because once it does, the content pipeline dries up. A permanent state of almost is far more profitable than resolution. Over time, this creates a distorted relationship with reality for the audience. People stop asking, "Is this true?" and start asking, "What if it happens tomorrow?" Decisions get delayed. Opportunities get missed. Capital sits on the sidelines waiting for a collapse that's always promised and never delivered. And when that happens, the cost isn't theoretical. It's real money, real stress, and real regret. What makes this even more troubling is how disagreement is handled. Anyone who brings up counterarguments is labeled blind, naive, or part of the problem. Debate isn't engaged with, it's dismissed. That's not how strong ideas behave. Strong ideas invite challenge because they can withstand it. Fragile ideas need loyalty tests. And here's the most important part. None of this requires bad intentions to be harmful. You don't have to believe there's some grand conspiracy or malicious plan. All it takes is a narrative that rewards exaggeration, discourages self-correction, and punishes doubt. Over time, the gap between the story and the evidence grows so wide that it can't be ignored anymore. At some point, viewers start to notice. They look back at old clips. They remember the urgency, the certainty, the promises. They compare that to where we are now. And once that comparison happens, the spell breaks. Not because someone told them what to think, but because the timeline speaks for itself. This is that moment. The moment where the narrative no longer gets a free pass just because it sounds confident. The moment where evidence matters more than vibes and accountability matters more than excuses. Because if a story needs infinite patience and zero verification to survive, then it's not a warning, it's a performance. Now let's talk about why all of this actually matters, because this isn't just about one storyline falling apart or one online persona losing credibility. This is about the real-world cost of fear being sold as financial wisdom and the quiet damage it does to people who trusted it. When fear becomes the product, the audience becomes the collateral. Think about what constant alarm does to the human brain. When you're told every day that collapse is imminent, that the system is rigged beyond repair, that everything you've worked for could vanish overnight. Your decision-making changes. You stop thinking strategically and start thinking defensively. You stop asking, what's the best move? And start asking, how do I survive? And survival mode is terrible for long-term financial health. People hold positions they should have exited. They avoid opportunities they should have taken. They keep waiting for the perfect moment that never comes because they've been conditioned to believe. That tomorrow is always the day everything implodes. That's not caution. That's paralysis. And paralysis has a cost that never shows up in thumbnails or emergency live streams. What makes this worse is how responsibility gets outsourced. Viewers slowly stop trusting their own judgment. Instead of learning how to analyze data, manage risk, or understand market cycles, they defer to a single voice that claims to see what everyone else can't. That's incredibly seductive because certainty feels safer than complexity. But it's also incredibly dangerous because when that certainty turns out to be wrong, the audience pays the price, not the narrator. And let's be clear, markets are messy. Economies are chaotic. No one has a crystal ball. That's fine. The problem isn't being wrong. The problem is building an entire brand around being right all the time, and then framing every miss as proof that the audience just needs more patience, more faith, more loyalty. At that point, it stops being education and starts looking a lot like conditioning. Fear peddling thrives on repetition. The same warnings recycled with new dates, the same charts reframed with new labels, the same conclusions regardless of changing conditions. Over time, viewers aren't being informed. They're being primed. Primed to expect disaster, primed to distrust alternative viewpoints, primed to dismiss anything that doesn't fit the narrative as propaganda or ignorance. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That kind of environment benefits the speaker far more than the listener. Engagement spikes. Communities form around shared anxiety. Products, subscriptions, and affiliations gain value precisely because fear keeps people emotionally invested. The scarier the outlook, the harder it is to walk away, because walking away feels like letting your guard down. But financial literacy isn't about staying scared. It's about staying grounded. It's about understanding probabilities, not prophecies. It's about adapting to reality, not fighting it because it doesn't match a prediction made years ago. When viewers are taught to see every normal market fluctuation as proof of impending doom, they lose the ability to distinguish between risk and noise. That's why this moment matters, because more people are starting to realize that being constantly warned doesn't mean being constantly prepared. They're recognizing that confidence without accountability is a red flag, not a feature. They're asking better questions. They're checking sources. They're comparing claims against outcomes instead of intentions. And that shift is powerful. It breaks the cycle. Once you stop consuming fear as entertainment, you start reclaiming your agency. You stop waiting for permission to think. You stop needing someone else to validate your anxiety. You begin to see that no single voice gets to define reality for you, especially when reality refuses to cooperate with their script. This isn't about telling people what to believe instead. It's about reminding them that skepticism is healthy, that disagreement is not betrayal, and that complexity doesn't mean deception. The world doesn't end every time a market dips, and it doesn't magically reset just because someone insists it must. Progress is uneven, systems are flawed, but exaggeration helps no one except those selling it. The real wake-up call here is understanding that you don't need a hero, a prophet, or a financial savior. You need tools, you need perspective, you need the confidence to say, show me the evidence, and the courage to walk away when the answers never come. Because trust should be earned through transparency, not demanded through fear. This is bigger than one channel, one persona, or one collapse narrative. It's about ending the era where panic is mistaken for insight and volume is mistaken for truth. It's about reminding people that their future is too important to be handed over to anyone who profits from keeping them afraid.